Welcome to the World Today, a program of Perry Worldhouse, the University of Pennsylvania's global affairs think tank. We are delighted to be partnering for this event with Penn's program on opinion and election studies and with the Fels Institute of Government. I hope everyone is safe and healthy during these unprecedented times and in light of the profound, challenging, and meaningful protests shaping our nation, as well as some of the destruction that has followed. I'm Michael Horowitz, the interim director of Perry Worldhouse and a professor of political science. Today's guests are Congressman Charlie Dent and Professor John Lapinski. Charlie Dent is a visiting fellow at Perry Worldhouse. For 7 terms, he represented the 15th District of Pennsylvania in the U.S. Congress. During that time, he served on several different committees, including the House Committee on Appropriations. Previously, he served on the Homeland Security Committee. He's currently a senior policy advisor at DLA Piper and a contributor on CNN. John Lapinski is the Robert A. Fox Professor of Political Science, the faculty director of the Robert A. Fox Leadership Program, and the director of the Penn Program on Opinion Research and Election Studies. He also serves as the faculty director for the Executive Masters of Public Administration Program within the Fels Institute of Government, and is the director of the Elections Unit at NBC News. He's got a lot of jobs. And he's one of my colleagues, and we're delighted to have him. John and Charlie, thank you for joining us today at Perry Worldhouse. And the floor is yours to give us some introductory thoughts about politics during a global pandemic, what's happening in Philadelphia, what's happening around the country. And Charlie, why don't we turn to you first? You're muted, Charlie.
Come on, there we go. That better? Okay,
Perfect.
We're good. Well, thank you, Michael, and great to be with John and everybody else who's joined this Perry Worldhouse program. First, here we are. Anybody remember impeachment? You remember when we all thought that maybe impeachment was going to be the issue that drove the election several months ago? And here we are with an unprecedented pandemic that has simply changed the narrative. Back at the beginning of the year, we were in a full employment economy. The economy was humming along pretty nicely. The president thought that was going to be his ticket to reelection. Of course, then comes the pandemic, and now we have unemployment rates probably north of 15%, 40 million Americans who are seeking unemployment assistance, and basically just an economy that's taken a nosedive as more than 100,000 Americans have died as a result of COVID-19. So that's kind of the framework. That's where we are today. And of course, just the events of last week with what has happened out in Minneapolis and Mr. Floyd, he obviously was killed so horribly in that incident with the police officer that has led to all these protests and riots across the country. So how does this affect the election and politics going forward? Well, we're really not sure. Nobody really has an answer. But my quick answer to all of this is this. The side that is more energized and more motivated and will be more organized, and that side typically has the advantage. During a pandemic of this nature, ordinarily you would think during a crisis of this magnitude, people would rally around their leaders, as we've seen in many countries, at least in Europe and New Zealand and some other countries where leaders have rallied, or where the people have rallied around their leaders. That has not happened in our country, obviously. The president's numbers probably have, if anything, gone down a little bit. So he is not. I hate to talk politics during a pandemic, but that's what we're doing. I hate to talk about that, but the reality is it doesn't appear that the president has gotten any boost at all in his ratings by the way he and the administration have handled the pandemic. In fact, if anything, the numbers have actually dipped. So I would just simply argue that that what we're dealing with here is unprecedented. People are going to be voting in different ways. Tomorrow in Pennsylvania is primary election day. Let me shut my door. I apologize. My dog just did that. Sorry. The primary is tomorrow. For the first time in Pennsylvania, we're actually voting by mail in large numbers. Prior to the change in law, which preceded the pandemic, the General Assembly and the governor changed the law to allow people to vote by mail for reasons other than being out of the county or being physically unable to go to the polls. Well, that was what we called absentee voting, which was very limited. But now basically you can vote by mail or absentee for virtually any reason. So we're starting that for the first time in Pennsylvania. Tomorrow will be the dry run, and I suspect we will see a lot more voting by mail in the fall as the pandemic will likely still be with us. So those are my preliminary thoughts, and I look forward to hearing from the audience and from John.
Professor Lapinski.
Thanks, Professor Horowitz. So I'll keep my remarks somewhat brief, and maybe I'll focus in a little bit more on just the elections. I'm sure we'll get lots of questions across the spectrum in a few minutes. So one of the jobs that I'm lucky enough to have is that in addition to all my Penn roles, I'm director of elections at NBC News. And so what that means is I run a team of about 60 to 70 people that basically produce all of, or help with all of NBC's election coverage and run the decision desk and make the projections, do all the analyses and all the quantitative work that has to do with the exit poll and other sorts of things. And I can say, one of the things is that I agree 100% that we're in very uncertain times. I mean, no one, usually in a presidential year, that's when, sort of when we look at NBC News and MSNBC and Telemundo and CNBC and all of the different properties of NBC Universal, I mean, the whole conversation would be about the presidential election, and then also, the congressional elections and what will happen in, again, across the board and for the election outcomes. But right now, it's wall-to-wall coverage on COVID. Now, obviously, with the terrible situation that's happening, there's been lots of coverage of the protests that are going on. But when we actually think about what the election is going to look like, though there's a lot of uncertainty with that. And what I mean by that is, how's it going to work? Essentially, when we're looking tomorrow, there's a big primary in Pennsylvania, right? And Congressman Dent had pointed out to the fact that, there's going to be, they've changed the way elections happen in Pennsylvania, and they're changing them across the country. And there's going to be a lot more mail balloting. There's going to be a lot more early in-person balloting in some states. But there's going to be a lot of pain, sort of in growing pains associated with that, right? And there's a lot of worry. Tomorrow in the primary, one of the things, that's going to be interesting and is going to just see, how's it going to work, for example, for people that want to in-person vote in Philadelphia, where there's going to be a lot less locations that are going to be available. And even though you can mail in a ballot, but you had to have already requested it in Pennsylvania, and there's going to be logistical issues because there's a lot of, worry from a, decision desk perspective. There's going to be a lot of states. This is a new thing for states, and what we've seen so far in the primaries that had to do a 360 and actually introduce mail balloting sort of at the last moment. They've had a lot of difficulties in actually counting the votes, making sure that everybody gets the ballots that they request. And so there's going to be real world implications on that. I can tell you from a decision desk perspective, one of the things that we're thinking is then when we look at a state like Pennsylvania, that's going to be so pivotal in what's going to happen in November is, the question is like, will we know who won Pennsylvania on election night? And I think the answer to that is, it's really maybe not, right? It's going to be, if you could imagine that, it used to be the case that Pennsylvania, even in, we saw in 2016 an extremely close election, but there weren't that many ballots that were remaining. And when I actually projected that election for NBC News, we'd done the back of the envelope and, all the math to see how many ballots could possibly be out there and could the outcome flip? Well, we're going to have a lot more ballots that aren't going to be counted on election night. And if we had more ballots that hadn't been counted or that were to be counted in 2016, if the same, if the rules that are going to apply in 2020, if they had retroactively been in place, Pennsylvania would not have been called, right? So, we would have been sitting on that for at least a day, maybe days. And so, at NBC, right now we're prepared, and I'm not saying that this will happen because there's so much uncertainty. one of the things that we're really spending a lot of time with is like, making sure that we can understand how the vote is going to be counted, and that it might be a very long process. In places like California, it takes 2-3 weeks, a month before all the ballots are counted. And that's primarily because of their mail balloting. So the question is going to be, how is that going to work, in Pennsylvania, and what rules? There's going to be a lot of lawsuits, right? One of the big lawsuits that's sitting out there right now is do you have to have somebody's ballot in hand by, sort of election day, or does it just have to be postmarked? And these issues, have become extremely partisan. Interestingly enough, I've done a couple polls on election administration, and I did one about a month ago, and I just released one today that I did with a partner organization. And one of the things we've asked some of the same questions across time. And initially, when we did that first wave of the survey, on looking at things like asking people whether they want, that you should be able to vote by mail, or you should, basically asking them a lot of election administration questions, kind of stuff that's a little nerdy and in the weeds. It wasn't a particularly partisan issue, but now in this next wave, it's become more partisan. So you see profound differences on between Republicans and Democrats on for example, should states allow for mail voting, or what other types of rules should they allow for? So I think that there's going to be a lot of hotly contested items that are going to be happening between now and election day. The one thing that I will leave with is that though there's so much uncertainty, and then we can turn it over to you, Professor Horowitz, for questions, is that though there's so much uncertainty, we're not sure exactly how some of these things are going to play out in the election, in the presidential election, how is the economy doing? How is the COVID crisis? Where are we come November? One of the things that has not changed is, and where there's amazing stability, is the president's approval numbers. So, Congressman Dent had said that, they're pretty stable. Maybe there's not a rally effect, but his, the support is just amongst his, the people that, are his supporters, is just rock solid. And I think it really is going to be about turnout. And it's going to be about turnout in a handful of states. That's going to be absolutely pivotal. But those numbers, how stable those numbers have been over the years, is amazing, given how much that has happened over the few years. And so I'll stop there and hand it back off to you, so you can marshal questions and proceed.
Charlie, do you want to jump back in on any of that? We've got a bunch of questions teed up, including a bunch on mail-in ballots.
Yeah, sure. I just a couple things on mail-in voting. This is a dry run for Pennsylvania. I'm not very concerned about tomorrow's primary because it'll be a lighter turnout, and I hope this will be a more manageable situation. But come the fall, if we have massive mail-in votes, I do worry that we may not have an election tally that night. And as was just stated by Professor Lapinski, that I am concerned too that we could have a California situation where I've seen for the last few cycles, it seems it takes California several weeks to count all the votes in many of these hotly contested congressional races. And I do fear that in Pennsylvania, we might not have an outcome, a definitive outcome on election night. So that's just something that keeps me up at night. When I was in the General Assembly of Pennsylvania, I was never a great fan of mail-in voting, although I kind of shifted. I think Pennsylvania's law has been too restrictive, but I don't want to go the direction of California either. I don't want to go that far. So I think we got to strike the right balance here, but I hate to do it, though, under these circumstances, even though they're necessary, that we do have to allow more mail-in voting because of what we're experiencing with the pandemic. So those are just a few thoughts. And one thing I also thought I should mention too, we were talking a little bit about the presidential race. There are, all the House seats are up, and, a third of the Senate. And from what I can tell, I think it's going to be, at least in the House, a status quo year. I do believe the Democrats will hold the House based on the numbers as I see it. I don't see it's very unlikely, probably remote, that the Republicans have any chance at all retaking the House. Not likely, not in the cards. The Senate is going to be hotly contested, maybe a coin flip right now, but it'll be very close in either direction there. But I look forward to talking about those elections as well.
So we've seen, following up on this mail-in ballot question and in John's point about the change in the survey data he's seen, we've seen applications for mail-in ballots jump from, according to one person in the Q&A, around 100,000 in the past to over 1 million right now due to COVID. There's at least some political science research that I've at least seen cited suggesting mail-in voting doesn't necessarily benefit either party. So in that case, and why has mail-in voting become so politicized if there's not a clear partisan edge?
Fear. I'll jump on that. I think it's fear, and I think that's correct. I've always said the side that is more energized, more motivated, will figure out a way to support their candidates, either by mail-in votes or at the polls. They'll get there. So, like I said, I tend to agree with that. I know many Republicans tend to think that mail-in voting hurts them, maybe because they're looking at California. Who knows? But I think it comes back down to the energy and motivation at the end of the day that will drive the winners and losers. There always seems to be an underlying dynamic that motivates voters, and I think that is much more powerful than all the technology and all the methods of voting that have been presented.
Yeah, I think on that point, I think you're right that a lot of people, when they think of mail-in voting, they think of the West Coast, not just necessarily California, but, Oregon was, pioneer in like going to all mail-in voting, California, Washington, Colorado, but the fact of the matter is that, when we looked at like the 2016 election, there were a lot of people that voted early, and it doesn't have to only be mail voting. There's a lot of in-person early voting also. And surprisingly, I think to your point, Professor Horowitz, that, it doesn't always, the evidence is very mixed on whether there's a partisan sort of advantage here. You see a lot of early mail and in-person voting in Tennessee. That's not a blue state. Right, we could go through a number of different southern states where it's pretty prevalent. Florida obviously has a lot of mail voting. The Republicans have done. There's been a lot of very close elections in Florida, but the Republicans have done well there, right? So I think that it is a perception thing, and I think also it has become more partisan because they're from the top, right? From President Trump has put out some tweets and other sorts of things of highlighting it, his opinions on it. But I think you're right that the academic research suggests it's mixed. And remember, mail voting also can take a lot of different forms, right? It doesn't, a lot of the partisan fights have to do with more the rules surrounding the mail voting, not mail voting itself. And so there's lots of different, things that will matter there. So, just like I had pointed out, there's a number of lawsuits right now that, want to basically, push what I consider to be more the California system where, just a ballot has to be postmarked by election day versus received. And I have to say, from a decision desk perspective, the California situation is extremely difficult, not just at the presidential level, but look at 2018, all of those congressional seats that were just sat there for weeks, right, where, you got these really close elections. And what you see is that in this voting that, when the counting lingers on for days, if not weeks, where it becomes really nerve-wracking, I think, for, obviously people that handle the elections, but also for people that are, just citizens, right, voters, and just watching it, is that it's just so consequential when there's close elections. And my gut is that there could be several very close elections, several very close races at the presidential level, and several close races down ballot, right? We've seen that time and time again. So you don't need to be a rocket scientist or a director of elections to know that. If we just go back and look at the last several elections, there's just been a lot of close ones. And I don't think there's any reason not to think that there'll be some more close ones in 2020.
So we've got over 250 people online watching, and a lot of questions flying in. And there's a cluster of them that actually get to in some ways, the different roles, but the roles that both of you have in the media now, and what the obligation of the media might be to, why do we say, socialize the American public to the idea that we might be a lot less likely to know the outcome on election night. How do we, is there a role for the media essentially in educating the American public on what both of you pointed out concerning the greater uncertainty about outcomes that we'll see in some of those lag times if more states are using mail-in ballots due to the pandemic?
Do you want to? I can take that, or you can either.
Sure.
Sure.
John, why don't you start first?
So I do think the media has a responsibility. I mean, but it's not in an activist way, but just making sure. But I think where the media has an obligation, this is like where we have these decision desks that I think play important roles. Making sure to be careful. Sort of when we're projecting these elections, is like we need to make sure that people understand that even though the process might take a long time, that the elections are legitimate, right? I mean, so I think that where the danger could be, and I think the media is setting some expectations, and we're already starting to do that, right? Of letting people know, that things could take longer. They already have in the primaries, right? We've seen in these, in the primaries, particularly post-COVID, that, we've seen, on the allocating delegates and doing other sorts of things, and things that we used to be able to do usually on election night have gone beyond election night just because of the nature of processing the ballots, which obviously the media has nothing to do with. All we do is like we're observers, right? So you got to be a little careful, right? Because we want to make sure that people understand the system, but on the other hand, the media should, should not intervene in any way, shape, or form. We just want to make sure that people understand and that we're reporting out and talking to election officials and making sure that election officials are also, putting them on air and having them talk. And so that, you set expectations of, it's not like, and so, because we don't want people to be alarmed if it does. First of all, it could be the case that we project the election on election night. We don't know that. Right, there's so much uncertainty with this election. It may be that we're able to project it for, who knows which side on election night. But just in case that it doesn't, I think the media's role is to make sure that people aren't alarmed, that people just understand. Everybody wants stuff now. The problem that we have, like with these decision desks that, are also that are out there that are projecting elections, and people are accustomed to knowing things pretty much immediately. But I think what we need to know is that, we'll make sure that the decisions desks need to be sort of accurate, and the media needs to be accurate in sort of relaying this information to the American public, but it will take as long as it takes. And I think that everybody just needs to understand that. And I think that hopefully people kind of do a little bit better in some places, like in California, in New York, and some of these other states where we had races lingering in 2018 for some time before we'd actually, in New Mexico, there was a race in Georgia where, it's going to take its due, it's going to take its due course. So yes, I do actually think that the media does have a role, and I think getting that out just to set expectations is going to be important, and also making sure that we are going beyond, sort of the Acela corridor to talk to election officials in a lot of various places and get them on TV is going to be, or in print or in other sorts of ways, is going to be actually pretty critical.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I participated in election night coverage in 2018 for CNN, and it was pretty clear to me that their mantra was to be accurate. It wasn't about being first; it was about being correct. And I think that takes a certain level of discipline, and across all news agencies, that they are going to have to. They shouldn't try to project too quickly. There's a temptation to do that, but at the end of the day, it's about providing accurate results and not calling anything until you're absolutely sure of the outcome. Now, that's going to be frustrating for many voters and many people like me who want to know. But at the same time, the worst thing that can have happen is you call it for one candidate only to find out that really you have to move this back to an undecided, and the outcome is unclear or could go the other way. Again, we've talked a lot about California because we are afraid of, we just don't want to see these situations linger for weeks. And I do think that's why there's this fear of mail-in voting, simply because of what we witnessed in California. And on the Republican side, I just want to mention this. I remember in 2018, several of those races, those House races, Republican candidates were leading on election night only to lose the elections weeks later. And so that's why I think many Republicans are skeptical about it. Based on one state, even though we have evidence in other states where there's mail-in voting, Republicans are doing fine. So there's something to think about. But at the end of the day, it's about accuracy. And for the first time, I'm really worried that Pennsylvania, could be one of those states where we just might not have that outcome quickly. And I hate to do this, a trial run in a year like this, but that's where we are.
Can I add one thing to that? Because I know all the other directors of elections at the major media outlets, and I know the folks at CNN. I don't think that I am confident that all of the major sort of decision desks at all the networks and cables, absolutely, it's about accuracy. The lessons were learned in the 2000 election. That was a long time ago, and that was before a lot of our times, for decision desk work. But that was kind of I think that the networks and the cables really learned something in that election, and I think they also learned something, even in in the 2018 election, is that you got to be very careful because things change. Even in the case of where we saw some changes in House races, there were marked differences between Election Day vote and the vote that came in after Election Day, and a lot of that wasn't even necessarily early. It wasn't even mail voting. A lot of it was provisionals, right? So there's other different types of votes that are counted afterwards, and provisionals. Those are votes that are sort of need to have additional information. There might be a problem with the ballot, so they have to fill out a provisional ballot. Maybe they're not, their name doesn't show up on the roll or something like that. And so those also are consequential when the races are, essentially almost dead heats. Look at what we saw in the Arizona Senate race, right? So I think that I'm actually pretty confident that the decision desks, and certainly I will not be with my decision desk racing to project an election. We absolutely have to be, 100%. We have our standard in NBC News is 99.5% confident before we project an election, but in reality, it needs to be higher than that. We just say 99.5 because you don't want to get any of them wrong. Right, you can't get a few wrong here and there. You project 400 plus House races. You can't get a couple of them wrong. So you really, really need to be careful because there's a lot at stake here. Sort of just for the legitimacy of our democracy. And I think that those of us that hold these positions kind of are profoundly aware of that.
So we have, I want to turn, we'll come back to elections, to the infrastructure surrounding elections before we end, but we've gotten several questions coming in about the protests that have erupted over the last week in the United States, beginning in Minneapolis and spreading elsewhere. And I understand that the answer could be that it's too soon to tell, but in thinking about the politics of this, who do you think is maybe more likely to be advantaged because of these protests? Is it a question of the protesters coming out and voting? Is it a question of the reaction to the protests and how it affects people's mindsets? Is there anything we can learn maybe from history and how these things could shape what happens at the ballot box? Charlie, you want to lead off and then we'll go to John?
Sure. I'll be happy to lead off on that question. I think, it's a little too early to tell. Everybody, witnessed with horror the killing of George Floyd that was so vicious and almost sadistic. And there was obviously a lot of sympathy to Mr. Floyd and his family. And there were, legitimate protests about that kind of police misconduct. But at the same time, as the images of the riots, are all over our television screens, and not just in Minneapolis, but all across the country. I think that image starts to sear into the minds of many people across the country. Even people who agree that there was police misconduct in Minneapolis and perhaps elsewhere, and that there needs to be justice. But at the same time, they can't abide looting, and they can't abide wanton destruction of property. So I think. If these riots continue, it kind of feels maybe like 1968 a little bit, You know, you think about, you know, after Martin Luther King was assassinated, and Robert F. Kennedy, and then of course the Democratic Convention, that actually accrued to the benefit of Nixon at the end because of what appeared to be a lawlessness. So I'm not saying that will happen in this election with President Trump, because he's, I know it's going to shock some people, but he's probably a more divisive figure than Richard Nixon was at that time, although many said Nixon was very divisive too, but not to this extent, obviously. So it's hard to say how these things will, you know, play out politically. But if these riots and this destruction continues much longer, I think that would probably benefit the president. If these protests become much more civil, much more peaceful, then I think that might help the Democratic side more.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It can. There's potential political gains for both sides. But I think that more, and I think it's really hard to know, because I think it could galvanize. I mean, the question is with some of the protesters, will they be able to be mobilized into votes for Democratic candidates, and how will this play out for the president's base? I think it could help, both sides, which is kind of, it's unfortunate that this is even, it's such a tragedy. It's crazy to even think about how this is going to potentially play out. But I think the more important thing in the short term is it will be interesting to see whether or not this has what type of influence this has with the Biden camp on who they're going to pick for their VP. I think it could have implications for that. I think President Biden is well underway in his vetting process. Obviously he hasn't even wrapped up the nomination technically yet, but that's he's quickly approaching the 1991 number, which is the number of delegates that he needs. Could even get it potentially tomorrow night, probably not, but could. And so I think that I think that this will put some added considerations into his mind on who he's going to actually pick.
So one interesting thing, I want to riff off of that, and a point that Charlie made at the beginning, is we've had 45 different questions come in, and not a single one, I believe, I could be wrong, and apologies for whoever asked the question if I'm wrong, but I believe not a single one has mentioned Joe Biden. And what does it mean that we're in the midst of a presidential election? We have a very controversial president, whether one loves him or hates him, and the Democratic nominee, despite his best efforts, doesn't really seem to be in the news very much, and certainly not on the front of the mind for at least the 250 plus people who have signed in for our conversation today. How does that influence the political dynamics in 2020?
Well, I think what this election is about in 2020 is the same issue it was about in 2018. The issue is the president of the United States. It's the president and his record and his conduct in office, I think, is what's driving the electorate. So as hard as Joe Biden will try to make it about sharing what his vision is for the country, I hate to say it's really not about Joe Biden. It's about Donald Trump at this point. Now, of course, and I think if I were a Democrat, I'd want to make that the issue. I want to make the president the issue because his numbers are not that strong, obviously. But at the same time, the president and his campaign, they're going to try to make this, a choice. And he will go on a really hard, ruthless attack on Joe Biden and his record and try to disqualify him. So the president is going to try to make this election a choice. Where the president's going to say it's about me and he'll say his terrific record and all the things that he has done. And he'll say, Joe Biden has, veered far left, and they'll make it about socialism. You can see where that's going. But what we've seen so far, at least since President Trump was elected, in 2017, 18, and 19, Republicans have really been beaten badly, particularly in the 18 in the midterm. But in 19, the suburban erosion for Republicans is dramatic, and it has accelerated substantially since Donald Trump was elected. And that really is I think the real soft spot for Republicans going into this election. the loss of the suburbs at such a dramatic rate. There simply are not, I don't think, and maybe Professor Lapinski can correct me on this, I don't think, based on my math, at least in Pennsylvania, that there are enough rural voters to offset losses in these suburban communities, not just in suburban Philadelphia, suburban Allentown, suburban Harrisburg, suburban Pittsburgh, to offset those losses in the suburbs. So I think that's fundamentally the problem for Republicans and for the president. And like I said, this election is about him. And it's tough for Joe Biden probably to accept that, and a lot of Democrats, but that's the reality. And he can win that way, by the way. I'm not sure that's such a bad thing for Joe Biden, by the way.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, but I would say that, what we saw in some of the earlier elections certainly was, looked good for Democrats. But on the other hand, it's all about enthusiasm, and it's unclear for sure. The question, for Vice President Biden, of course, is like, will he be able to sort of, generate that type of enthusiasm? And I think that's the question. But I think that there's no doubt this election is about Trump. More, probably more so than it is about Vice President Biden. And that would be the case that would be the case also when other incumbents presidents have lost, right? It's like really when you're an incumbent president, you're an incumbent president. So that's just kind of the nature of running as an incumbent, that election really is going to be more about, you, your record, yourself as a person. It's just almost, I think, almost inevitable. I think that we shouldn't also, though, be, we need to be a little bit careful, even though if people right now didn't raise, I don't know how many people were raised President Trump instead of Vice President Biden, because maybe they didn't raise either in the chat room. But one of the things that that I've noticed at NBC is like, we're getting almost nothing on right now that has to do with politics, just in general. Like, there's very, very little. It was, obviously it's been the protests over the last several days, but before that, it's like, continually talking about COVID and what do experts think about it. And usually they tell us that they don't know. Right. So, but like we hear it we hear that sliced a lot of different ways. And so, obviously because this is the crisis of our lifetime in so many ways. But make no mistake, right? Come Labor Day, the presidential race is on, right? So like we will see Vice President Biden, a lot of him, and we will see, I don't know in what form, like, whether it be, I think that depends upon, the public health situation. But this election is maybe the most consequential one of our generation, whether you are a supporter of President Trump or not. And so I really think that the dynamics, are going to, some of the dynamics that we expected to see before this whole crisis came about, we will still see them. It's just that it's on a delayed timeline, and we will still see, the types of, there's, we will be blanketed with commercials. We will not only, I guarantee you will not only have to watch car commercials and Uber Eats, come post Labor Day. The attention will turn back to November.
Yeah, and as a CNN contributor, I can tell you, a political contributor, I've been a lot less busy since COVID. Because the coverage has been not just on CNN, but the other networks has been so COVID related, and they want medical experts, and you're right. And the politics, the campaign has really has just been of less of interest, it seems. And but as time drags on, we're going to be talking a lot more politics, guaranteed.
Yep, I
so
agree.
Let me ask a question now that a couple people have raised in the chat in different ways that cross over in some ways the question of the protests and the politics of those that cross over COVID and its impact, and that's the question of disinformation in American politics, misinformation in American politics. And several people have asked variants on the question of whether our system is more prepared to deal with disinformation and fake news yet. In light especially of President Trump's recent battle with Twitter, Facebook's Zuckerberg's very public sort of I don't want anything to do with this sort of statement, et cetera. Are we better prepared than in 2016 to manage some of these issues across, I mean, just give it how long 2020 has lasted already. I mean, who even knows what we'll be talking about?
You know, I guess the answer, this is not the answer you want to hear, we'll see. Or maybe I really don't know. But what is different, I think, this time is that, well, even there's disinformation, you know, I mean, as consumers of information, we have to be very discriminating, and we have to be able to distinguish between, you know, real news and garbage. And I think it doesn't help, frankly, when the president of the United States, you know, tweets out things about Joe Scarborough, you know, basically this outrageous claim that somehow he may have been involved with the death of a staffer when, you know, it was a tragic, you know, accident. You know, I mean, and the president puts that out there in a way, and he had a history of doing it. He did the same thing with the birth certificate with President Obama. There were other issues too where he's kind of spread that kind of well, dishonesty or misinformation, and so coming from, you know, positions of authority, I think that makes this issue even more difficult to manage, because we of course we have to be concerned about disinformation coming from adversaries, whether they be in Russia or North Korea or Iran and others who want to manipulate us in very sophisticated ways. You know, we have, you know, frankly, the president putting out information too. It's not making this easier. So I think the answer is, we're not sure how this is going to play out just yet, but I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think one of the difficult things that the media has is that there's a lot of distrust of the media. When you look at, and I'm talking about, like, you know, sort of the networks and the cables and all of that. I mean, when you actually look at the polling numbers, there's just a lot of people that don't, and even when you look at some of the rating data, I mean, I've examined rating data where we've seen drop off, like on people, you know, who watch, you know, watch traditional media and who used to and no longer do that. And so I think one of the problems that you know, our democracy faces is that for the people that just distrust, you know, many sources, like where are they going to get their information? Like, I mean, where are you going to turn? And so I think that's one of the things that I struggle a little bit with, to come up with a good answer on how the problem will be solved. And so, I mean, I don't think that it's, you know, certainly I think that I'm still a hopeful person. And I think that a lot of people, I think the American public is smart. You know, I think it's smart across partisanship. And so I think that, you know, you don't want to discount people's abilities to sort of figure stuff out. But on the other hand, you know, there are some problems with this lack of faith in institutions that I think is a little damaging for our country.
So three different people have now asked varieties of a question asking about, can the election be canceled by President Trump? You know, seeming to, you know, worry, given, I think, some commentary on social media that, you know, could the November election be delayed? Is this something that people should be concerned about, or is this something that is less of a big deal?
I don't think the president can cancel an election. I mean, I couldn't think of a circumstance, unless there was some kind of traumatic national disaster, you know, a nuclear event. Who knows? But I think the short answer is no. He can't cancel the election. And I always like to say, we don't have a national election in this country for president. We have 50 state elections, and so these elections are going to go on. You know, in November. And I just can't imagine a circumstance under which the president could cancel it, you know, notwithstanding this pandemic, and maybe this pandemic becomes more severe again in the fall. But I believe the election will proceed, you know, either by mail-in or in-person voting, but we're going to have the election. And I think that would probably, if the president were to suggest that he was going to cancel this election, that would just be a crisis of a constitutional crisis of epic proportions, I would think. That would not go over well with anyone.
Yeah, I'm not that worried about that. That's like, you know, he doesn't really have the authority to do that. But the question, you know, just is like, you know, whether, I mean, I think that, you know, there's a lot of worry out there, like, right, of whether the process could be tampered with. I don't really think, though, that's the
yeah, there are some questions in the Q&A actually about kind of like tampering with mail-in ballots, you know, worries about things the president might do or that others might do.
Well, I don't think either the president or others, like, you know, I don't really have a lot of worry, sort of about ballots being tampered with and all of that. I think that I think the bigger issue is going to be that there's going to be it's going to be a big fight, right? And it is going to be partially a partisan fight on, who's going to be what are the rules of going to be the rules that govern the process? And I think that some of these court cases, could linger right up to the election, right? I mean, there's probably a dozen cases out there right now that are fighting this issue in all the battleground states of whether or not mail-in ballots can be just postmarked by election day. And the question is like, how's that going to work? And you see, you've seen all of the other big sort of political fights that are going on. Pick your state, right? Texas, right? Is COVID a legitimate excuse to, to cast an absentee mail ballot? Right? So, so you can go through literally, there's going to be dozens and dozens of cases probably that they already sort of have emerged. And there's going to be big, sort of big fights. And I think this is also where information is going to be important. And, there's going to be a lot of different organizations that are out there that want to make sure that people understand the process. Right? I mean, there's always going to be bad actors out there. And I think they could be on both, either side of the partisan fence, right? Where, every election, you'll go on and you'll see an article that will talk about how people were called and told, given the wrong voting location or other, sort of stuff like that. But, we've done a lot of analysis of this, and, there's nothing that I have seen like in the past, and I really don't expect it in the future that there's going to be some, something that's like, systematic that's going to, sort of play across the country to the point of what Congressman Dent had suggested, that we don't have national elections. We have state elections, right? So when we were talking about in 2016 and, with all the security issues where there might've been foreign influence and all that, our elections are so decentralized. And it's not just that we have state elections. Basically, we have county elections, right? Or townships and boroughs and other sorts of things, depending upon what your unit is in your state, parishes in Louisiana, townships up north in the New England states. And so these are very, very decentralized.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to Professor Lapinski is look, I think that in-person voting is safer and more secure than mail-in voting. And I'm not saying that there's going to be a problem with mail-in voting or absentee voting, but when we have typically seen, where we more typically see problems is in the absentee balloting process. Remember what happened in North Carolina in the 2018 cycle. The Republican candidate was the beneficiary of a guy who was going around harvesting these ballots and in a what appeared to be a very fraudulent way, and that basically they had to redo the election because it was so close. Even in Philadelphia, you may remember that. I don't know, some of you aren't old enough on this call, perhaps, but I remember in the 1990s we had a special election for the state senate in North Philadelphia. Bruce Marks versus Stinson. Marks won at the polls at the machines by 500 votes, but lost the absentee ballots by a margin of 20-1. And investigations, Pulitzer Prizes were won, and the Democrat Stinson was unseated because he lost at the federal judge threw out all the absentee ballots. So the point I'm making is it's easier to manipulate votes by mail because people can do things. I'm not saying it's going to happen in a big way or a substantial way, but you just have to be more concerned about security with those ballots, as far as I'm concerned, than you do at the direct at the polls.
Yeah, so I want to follow up with a question that asked about, goes back to a comment that John made about the stability of President Trump's coalition, how strong his support is among Republicans. And when we start with you on this one, Charlie, we saw in 2016, different Republican politicians take very different tacks in approaching President Trump's remarks, whether to disavow them, whether to support them. He's made some very, very controversial statements about the protests and how to respond to them, especially in a call with governors earlier today, where he talked about dominance. I mean, do you see the possibility of Senate and House Republican candidates, maybe in swing states, sort of disavowing some of his remarks and policy positions, or is everyone just going to fall in line because he's the president now?
Well, what's happened to Republicans is that that for many Republicans who represent those swing districts or swing states, I think they'll be forced to disassociate themselves from the president in some way. I mean, they're in a horrible position. If you're a Martha McSally or a Cory Gardner or a Susan Collins or even a Tom Tillis in these Senate seats, or take it closer to home, Brian Fitzpatrick in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, I can't imagine scenarios where embracing the president is going to help them win their elections. They in those states, particularly in Maine and Colorado, yes, you need to keep your Republican base together, but you have to win probably a majority of the independent voters and pick up not an inconsequential number of Democrat crossover votes. I mean, that's the math to win. And so I would argue, the argument I would make to my former Republican colleagues, those who don't represent, safe ruby red districts, that they better find some distance. And you just can't develop a brand, by the way. You're what, 5-6 months out to the election? Good luck trying to develop a brand in 6 months. If you haven't developed your brand by now, you're probably not going to be able to do it over the next few months. And that's why I'm watching these Senate elections in particular. I think of those competitive Senate races. I think in many respects, Susan Collins is better positioned to win re-election than many of those other senators, only because she has developed a brand that is pretty independent for many years. And then I think that will help her, but that won't necessarily save her, but I think she's in better shape. But so they have to develop a brand, and there has to be distance. And many Republicans who lost in the 2018 cycle in those House districts did represent those suburban districts that were, tended to be more educated, a bit more affluent, and they were just swept out, and largely because of the president. There was really nothing they could do. So, warning to the Republicans that they have a diminishing their base. The base is diminishing. I hear the numbers too. Everybody talks about the Republican base being solidly behind the president. That's true, but it's a diminished base. It is smaller than it had been because many have either disaffiliated from the party, have gone independent, or maybe gone to Democrats. And so they're only really measuring those who still identify or self-identify as Republicans. So short answer is develop some distance between yourself and the president, because you're not going to survive otherwise.
John?
I think that, I'm pretty much what Congressman Dent said is, covers most things that I've been hearing people say. It really is going to be sort of about mobilization. I like your point. It is going to be a difficult, the path for the Democrats winning majority control in the Senate is just what you had talked about, right? The Senate's got some really tough races for the Republicans to hold. And so I really think that it's going to be interesting to see how, particularly in North Carolina, how those waters are navigated, for the Republicans, just because I think they have a tough, North Carolina is a state that should be very hard for the Democrats to pick up. But I think that race is going to be really it's a toss up.
Yeah, watch North Carolina. Hey, watch Kansas too. If the Republicans, go down get this briar patch and nominating Chris Kobach again, that seat could be very much in play. Democrats are going to probably lose one seat in the Senate. The Alabama seat, Doug Jones, that'll be gone in all likelihood. So just keep that in mind. But the Democrats are very competitive in all those other states, including Iowa, and maybe even one of the Georgia seats. And so the ground is shifting. I'm not saying Georgia and Texas are now purple states, but I would say they're a much lighter shade of red, much closer to pink, and moving towards purple, but they're not there yet. But that said, in a bad year, we've seen, you could potentially see a loss in a state like Georgia this time around.
But you could see also that it may not be a bad year. And so one thing that I think that a lot of people are thinking about is that this is the year for the Democrats to sort of win the trifecta. like in the sense of I don't like betting on horses, and I certainly don't like, I'm not a gambler, but I would also say that people should not discount the fact that President Trump is he is a formidable candidate, like, right? So like and it really is the case in some of these other races that you could see it where the Democrats are able to pick up a place like North Carolina, but you could also see it where, the Republicans maybe hold some of these seats and they win the Alabama seat maybe. And so I really feel like there's just like, I feel like there's a lot more uncertainty this cycle through, just because we don't know, we don't know, like, is there going to be a second wave of COVID in the fall? We don't know, like, if there is, like, or if there or a little bit earlier, like, or there's no, miracle therapeutic, or there's not, sort of a vaccine candidate, it could go either way. There could be, or there might not be, like, right. And then, what's the unemployment rate going to be sitting at? We know that, like, there's going to be a lot of people hurting. The question is like how many, like, right? It's regardless, we know it's going to be a lot, but it could be a tremendous amount, or it could be a lot less. And I think that these things are going to map in. So, like from again, I'm wearing my decision desk hat here. I'm prepared for a lot of different scenarios. I always am prepared for a lot of scenarios, but like, usually I have in my head going into an election, maybe 3 scenarios that could happen. I'm thinking more could be like 5 or something, like, right? Like, so it doesn't seem like a lot more, but there's a lot to prepare for just because of the volatility that I'm seeing.
The only thing I would add to what the Professor Lapinski just said there is that, particularly with the Senate, I often find that the Senate, some of those competitive Senate races will likely go the way the presidential race goes. That was one of I got a lot wrong in 2016. The one thing I did predict correctly, as I said, that whichever party won the presidency in 2016 was going to control the Senate. Well, that's what happened. That all those Senate races broke the same way the presidential did. And so, I think the same thing is likely to happen this time again with the Senate. So if whichever party wins the presidency, I think will also probably win the Senate, even though it's going to be close in either direction, because there aren't that many competitive seats, and the Democrats are likely to lose one out of the gates. And again, and back to what I said earlier, on the House side, the Democrats will likely regain the House. The only question is, do they pick up some seats or lose a few seats? Because they're already starting there with an advantage. They're going to pick up 2 seats in North Carolina due to redistricting. The Will Hurd seat in Texas, that's gone, for Republicans. So I can see the Democrats already have 3 seats going into their column right out of the gates. So that makes it even more daunting for Republicans, given their retirements, as well as redistricting, even though the Democrats have more defense to play, but they're very well capitalized. Their incumbents in those swing districts are very strongly capitalized right now.
Yeah, these races are not independent races. There's no question about that. So like when you see on election night, if things are starting to go one way or the other, they'll continue probably to go that way. They're definitely not independent. These races are not independent. We saw that, and we see that, we usually see that in elections, but right now we just don't know. We know that they're not independent. We just don't know which way they're going to go.
All right. So we're almost out of time here. So let me take you out on a question that we ask everybody that's been a guest in the world today since we started this virtual event series in the wake of COVID, which is essentially a version of Tell Me Something Good. In that a lot of what we've talked about over the last several months has been about doom and gloom, and particularly given the pain felt around a lot of the country today, given the horrific Floyd killing and the aftermath. Imagine, we're in December 2020, and things in America are looking up. What does that mean happened?
No, I guess I'll start on that. I guess, look, I think the American people are very resilient. I really do. That, yeah, we're going through a terrible time with this pandemic, but we'll get through it. I'm confident that the therapies are going to be developed. There will be innovation. Hopefully there'll be a vaccine. Maybe there won't, but we will get through it and we'll come out of it stronger. I think the economy is going to come back, but it's going to be in fits and starts. And it'll be a lot of pain, and we're going to learn a lot from this. And I think that we will make adjustments to our lives, some of which will be better. And I'm hoping that we can capitalize that, even with the protests and the riots. Look, we're all developing. I think hopefully everyone's developing a greater appreciation for the plight of those as we witnessed with COVID, particularly how our minority communities have been, disproportionately impacted in terms of the number of cases and deaths. And I think we all become a bit more sensitive to this. And of course, with the George Floyd killing, I hope we better understand each other as Americans and where we're all coming from, even if we don't always agree. I'm hoping, but I think we're fundamentally a good people, and we want to make this country better, and we try to improve. It's an imperfect union, and we just keep working at it. But we're tough, we're resilient, and we're gonna respond better than a lot of these other countries that I don't think have what we have in America, this ability to innovate and to and to adapt.
Yeah, so for me, Mike, the thing that I will say that I will give you that's good is I agree with everything that Congressman Dent has said. I think that the American public is a very resilient public, but I think that if you asked all 250 people on the call, could you come up with, a list of people that you've known that have sort of gone above and beyond, right, to help? So there were two things that have happened to me over the last couple of weeks that made me think that there's these amazing people out there that are really stepping up. Fels had a talk a couple of weeks ago for the head of the guy that heads up the Broad Street Ministries in Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. And basically he talked about how Broad Street Ministries, was the only shop in town that was providing the homeless with meals, a place to clean themselves, and also a mailbox so that they can get their, if they have any kind of benefits or things coming. And they went from doing 500 meals a day to 2,000 almost immediately. And he said, wow. So, I thought, there are people here, that are, sort of stepping up. Another one is from a family member of mine, my sister. She's a public health nurse in Seattle. And she was asked to transfer from basically, every public health nurse job is kind of a tough job. But transfer from working with helping mothers, with their newborns to helping, organize the COVID response for the homeless in Seattle. And she just immediately, she jumped in and did that without question, right? And she didn't think about it, and so I think all of us have a family member or a friend or just a bunch of other people that we've run into, and hopefully ourselves, where, people are sort of stepping up and trying to help in a time that's in tough times. And I'm seeing a lot of people doing that. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not going to be people that are, out for themselves and all that and aren't doing the right thing. But I think there's a lot more people on the good side than the bad side. And I think we all have examples of them. So I'd leave you with that. That's where I see my hope.
Well, thanks to Congressman Dent and Professor Lapinski for joining us for this great event, collaboration between Perry World Houses, The World Today, PORS, and Fels. We hope you all will join us next week for our June 9th event, From Black Death to Yellow Fever, Disease, Death, and Distancing in World History. We're all doing our best in this extremely difficult and challenging time. I hope that everybody is safe and healthy. And thanks again, Charlie and John, for joining us today. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody who tuned in learned a lot as well.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
Have a great day, everybody.
Take care.